It started with a rental, a cinnamon scone, and a silence that felt less lonely than usual. Daniel Whitaker lived like the house he occupied, dignified, weathered, and mostly silent. The old Victorian perched on the hill above the harbor, its gabled windows catching morning light like a secret. From behind one of them, Daniel often sat with a mug of black coffee and a sketch pad balanced on one knee, watching the town wake up. He didn't spy, he observed. There was a difference. He sketched people more than buildings now. Architecture had once been about grand design, crisp geometry. These days he preferred the crooked edges of strangers sitting under umbrellas or walking dogs that pulled too hard. When the lines behaved, he let them stay. When they didn't, he tore out the page and began again. Most people in town knew him by name, but only in the way you know the man who rebuilt the porch on the library or designed the new fire station. He was polite but distant, always alone. There were rumors, of course. He was a widower, a recluse. Some even said he was a genius, the kind of man who looked like he might have had a softer smile once, before something closed the door behind it. He delivered his blueprints to the community center office just after 10 that morning. The front desk manager, who had a habit of calling him Sir, even though he'd asked her not to, waved him into the side office where Sophie Leclair was crouched on the floor, surrounded by a scatter of test prints and swatches of muted pastel. She wore a long cardigan that trailed like a cape and a pair of mismatched socks. She looked up and smiled. Not the kind of smile that asks something of you, just the kind that exists because it wants to, the kind that makes you feel important without even trying. Daniel, she said brightly, perfect timing. I need a ruling on which of these fonts screams community togetherness without screaming middle school talent show. He glanced at the papers. That one, he said, pointing. It's the only one that doesn't look like it's apologizing for being readable. Sophie grinned. A man after my serif preferences. He handed over the rolled blueprints. Here's the revised plan. I adjusted the overhang for the east entrance, so it won't catch the wind. Thank you, she said, standing and brushing her knees. You always think of the parts no one notices, until they break. He gave a non-committal nod, but her words landed. It was the sort of compliment he didn't know where to put. As she unrolled the plans on the desk, she said casually, if I seem a little wired today, it's because my landlord just gave notice. He's selling the building, and the new owner isn't renewing any of the leases. Curiosity piqued, Daniel asked, when do you have to be out? In 2 weeks, Daniel frowned. That's short notice. It's almost certainly illegal. She shrugged one shoulder. The life of a renter. The studio's fine. It's a different lease, but I need to find a new place to sleep and drink too much chamomile tea. He hesitated. Are you looking for somewhere local? I'd prefer not to commute, she said, but between high rent and 2 cats who think they own the place, my options are limited. There was a long pause. Daniel wasn't impulsive by nature. Most of his decisions were measured, timed, and cross-checked against cost and consequence. But something about Sophie, the way she talked, like sunlight filtered through curiosity, made him speak before he thought. My guest house is empty. Sophie blinked. Your guest house? Behind the main house. It has a private entrance and its own kitchen. I used to rent it to a traveling nurse, but it's been vacant for a while. She tilted her head, wary but not unkind. A little curious, maybe. Are you offering it to me? If you're interested, no pressure, it's quiet, but the light's good in the mornings. Sophie studied him for a beat, then gave a small smile. You don't strike me as someone who volunteers his space. I'm not. The guest house won't compromise my space and will allow you to have your own. That seemed to settle something for her. Let me think about it. He nodded. Of course. They parted with a brief handshake, though Sophie added a warm, thanks, Daniel, before returning to her work. As he walked back up the street toward home, Daniel tried not to think about why he'd made the offer. He told himself it was practical. She needed a place. He had one. It was logical, simple, a transaction one makes without considering. At least, that's what he told himself. Daniel didn't need a renter, but he had offered, and she needed a place to stay. It was nothing more than that. But part of him knew better. Part of him had seen how she looked at the guest house once, months ago, when she'd stopped by to drop off a poster design. she'd stood at the gate and said, "This place feels like the kind of storybook house you run away to." Daniel hadn't known how to answer her then. He wasn't sure he did now. The guest house sat behind Daniel's home like a well-kept secret, a one-bedroom cottage wrapped in ivy and morning light. It had been built decades ago for a relative who never lived long enough to move in. Daniel had refurbished it himself over several winters. It was quiet, private, and steeped in a calm that made clocks feel unnecessary. Sophie arrived late Saturday morning with a modest hatchback and 3 cardboard boxes labeled studio things, kitchen essentials, and cat diplomacy. A 4th box, unmarked, held a tangled string of fairy lights, a worn pair of ballet slippers, and a sketchbook with smudged pages. Other than her clothing, surprisingly little for a woman her age, she had little else. Daniel met her outside, hands in his jacket pockets, watching as she opened the trunk. "You weren't joking," he said. "You travel light." She smirked. "That's what happens when your last place was the size of a generous walk-in closet. I had to choose between a couch and a coffee table. Guess who won?" "I'd say couch, but your posture says otherwise." "Touché," she said, lifting the box of kitchen gear. "I was planning on paying movers, but then I remembered I'm not made of money and own zero furniture." "Then it's a good thing the cottage is furnished." Daniel didn't offer to help. He didn't ask. He just reached in and took a box before she could protest. She didn't stop him. The cats, one sleek and gray, the other ginger and judgmental, padded around the cottage as she explored the space. The floors were polished wood, the windows deep set and generous with the light. A small writing desk sat beneath one, and the kitchen was spacious. It felt more like a favor than a rental, like he saw something in her she hadn't shown him. Sophie stood in the center of the living room, taking it all in slowly. "This doesn't feel like a rental." "It isn't," Daniel said from the doorway. "Just a space with room to breathe. Not everyone needs to fill that kind of space." She glanced at him. "You say that like someone who's been suffocated before?" He didn't respond, but his mouth tugged in something like acknowledgement. As she unpacked, Sophie found small signs of Daniel everywhere. Not personal clutter, but touches of someone who noticed details. There was a ceramic hook by the door, shaped like a leaf. In the living room sat an old side table refinished with care. Cushions of various shades littered the window seat, providing color and character. That afternoon, she left a batch of cinnamon scones cooling on a plate. When the scent filled the space, she took 2, wrapped one in parchment, and tiptoed to Daniel's back porch. She placed the bundle beside the door with a note scrawled in blue pen. "For the man who offered me shelter, literally." The next morning, the plate was gone, and in its place sat a folded napkin with a single word written in neat, architectural script. "Thanks." The days passed with an ease Sophie hadn't realized she missed. She taught dance classes some evenings, not every night, just a few times a week, and spent her mornings either sketching or running errands. In the afternoons, she worked on her freelance designs, often in the sunlit nook of the guest house kitchen or the cozy window seat. Daniel kept his distance, but he was not cold. They passed like ships, exchanging nods, quiet greetings, the occasional wry observation about the weather, or the town's sudden obsession with artisanal pickles. One evening she found him in the garden. Daniel didn't seem like the gardening type, but there he was, kneeling beside a bed of lavender with soil on his palms and a quiet focus in his eyes. "I didn't take you for a lavender man," she said, leaning on the fence post. "I like the smell," he replied without looking up. "Keeps the cats out of the time." "Ah, so it's strategic." He stood, brushing dirt from his hands. "You bake. I plant. We both lean into quiet acts of control." Sophie tilted her head. "That's the most poetic way I've ever been called a control freak." Daniel gave a rare half-smile. "I said it with respect." She wandered closer, toes scuffing in the gravel. "You're not what I expected." He looked at her. "What did you expect?" "Something grumpier, broodier, more tortured architect trope." "I can brood if you'd like," he said deadpan. She laughed. "No, no, you're fine, just like this." It was a crossroads, a moment that could have turned into something or nothing. But Daniel simply nodded once and returned to trimming the rosemary. That night, Sophie sat on the little porch of the guest house with a mug of tea and a pencil in her hand. She flipped through an old sketchbook, paused at a drawing she'd forgotten she'd made, a silhouette of a man in a window, half lit by morning sun. She hadn't realized it was Daniel until just now. Below it, she wrote, "The ones who see best are often the ones who hide." She didn't know if she meant him or herself, maybe both. Daniel's house was quiet in the mornings. He liked it that way. The stillness let him think, or at least not think too much. He made coffee in a stovetop kettle, the kind that hissed softly just before the boil. He poured it into a chipped mug with a faded blueprint etched on the side and sat by the window with his sketchbook open. Through the glass, he could just make out Sophie in the guest house yard. She was standing on tiptoe, coaxing a stubborn lemon balm plant into an upright posture with twine. One of the cats lounged nearby, sun-dazed and perfectly unbothered. Daniel's phone buzzed on the table. Claire. He picked up, already knowing the tone she'd take. His sister had a knack for wrapping concern in honey and handing it over like a compliment. "Hey," he said. "Hey, stranger, you alive out there?" "Mostly." Claire chuckled on the other end. "Just checking. I had a dream last night that you joined a commune and gave up drafting for goat milking." Tempting. There was a pause, just long enough to carry intention. "So," she said, the slow cadence of someone digging for information, "anyone staying with you lately?" Daniel leaned back in his chair, tapping the mug with his thumb. "Sophie. She's renting the guest house." "The Sophie who designed those illustrations for the library fundraiser." "That's the one." Claire's voice softened, but he could hear the shift in her posture. Protective, not judgmental. "And this is purely a rental arrangement?" "She needed a place. The timing worked. That's all." "Mm-hmm." Claire. "I didn't say anything," she said, "but I know that tone. I've known it since you were 15 and said you were just studying with Megan Hollis." Daniel exhaled. "This is different." She let that sit, then said more gently, "I'm just looking out for you. You know that. You don't exactly open the door for many people." "I didn't," he said. She just, like there'd never been a door at all. There was a longer pause, then her voice warmed. "Well, I look forward to meeting her. The kids have been begging for a trip to the coast, and I'm due for a nosy sister visit, complete with bribes and hugs." Daniel gave a half smile. "You're always welcome." "Good, because I'd come either way." That afternoon, Sophie knocked on his back door with something tucked under her arm. "I made you something," she said, holding out a small hand-bound notebook, "or rather, repurposed something you left in the blueprint folder." He opened it. Inside were scans of one of his old architectural sketchbooks. Houses, elevations, ornamentation, but interspersed with her illustrations. Birds nesting on windowsills. A cat stretching on a sun-warmed stair. A woman curled up in a reading nook with a house rising like a dream around her. "You drew over my sketches?" he asked, more amused than annoyed. "Technically, I layered them," she replied. "Digital enhancement. I call it, if Daniel had a softer imagination." He stared at the pages for a moment longer than he intended. Her drawings didn't distort his lines, they expanded them, added life where he had only drawn structure. He flipped to a page where she'd sketched a girl dancing barefoot across a blueprint of a sunroom, her shadow stretched like a ribbon across the floor. "I hope that's okay," she said, suddenly cautious. "It's more than okay." She smiled, then glanced toward the guest house. "I've got class tonight. Just two girls, sisters. One of them has the posture of a cat on roller skates, but she tries so hard. Reminds me why I still love it." He nodded, remaining quiet before saying, "Even if it's not the stage you imagined." Sophie tilted her head. "That's not nothing, coming from you." "I wasn't always this still," he admitted. She studied him for a moment, as if weighing what to ask and what to leave alone. Instead, she said, "Well, for what it's worth, I don't think stillness is a flaw." He didn't respond, but he didn't look away either. That night, Daniel wandered into his office and found one of his older sketchbooks tucked between books on architectural theory. He hadn't opened it in years. It was the kind he used to fill when he couldn't sleep, before the quiet became his defense. Near the back was a drawing of a house he'd never built, all glass and curve, with a garden terrace and a long reading alcove that overlooked the sea. He remembered showing it to someone once, years ago. She'd said, "It's beautiful, but it's not for me." He had never drawn a house for anyone else again, until now. He flipped open Sophie's altered sketchbook and traced the lines she'd added with her careful hand. Warm, whimsical, light. The blueprint hadn't changed, but it felt like maybe, finally, someone might want to live there. The studio was quiet when Sophie arrived, as it always was at this hour. Late afternoon sun slanted in through the tall windows, dusting the wooden floor with light and shadow. She unlocked the door, flicked on the small stereo, and set her bag on the bench near the wall. Her students would arrive in an hour, two sisters who were still learning how to tell their left foot from their right, but had enough spirit to power a small town. Before class, she liked to move alone, nothing formal, just enough to remind her body it still knew how. She stretched slowly, easing into each motion like greeting an old friend she wasn't sure she trusted. She stood in the center of the room, raised one arm, and began to dance. No music, just breath and memory. Her movements were smaller than they used to be, more grounded. She didn't jump or turn too sharply. She knew better. But some old part of her, the part that still believed in the performance, in the escape, urged her forward. She tried one slow turn, then another, and then reached into an arabesque, her supporting leg firm beneath her. Until it wasn't. Pain flared in her knee, sharp and sudden. She gasped, stumbling sideways and catching the bar for balance. Her vision blurred for a moment. The ache pulsed, not unbearable, but familiar. A warning. She sank onto the floor, pressing her palm into the muscle above the joint, cursing herself. That's when she heard the door open. Daniel stood in the doorway, one hand still on the frame, looking like even he wasn't sure how he got there. "I didn't mean to interrupt," he said quietly. "It's okay," she managed. "I wasn't expecting anyone." "I was walking," he added, as if he needed to explain his presence. "You stumbled." Sophie nodded, still catching her breath. "It's an old injury, nothing dramatic." He hesitated, then crossed the room, kneeling beside her. "Can you stand?" She nodded again. He offered his hand. She took it. His grip was steady and unhurried, the way he did everything. He helped her to her feet, guiding her to the nearby bench. Once she was seated, she looked at him and smiled faintly. "Thanks. It flares up sometimes, just when I think it won't." He said nothing, just sat beside her in silence. She appreciated that. No questions, no pity. When the students arrived, Daniel took his leave without a word, nodding once at Sophie as he passed. She watched him go, her knees still aching, but her heart steadier. The next afternoon, Daniel found himself standing outside the studio again. He told himself he was just passing by. A walk, nothing more. But when he glanced through the window and saw Sophie gesturing to one of the girls, her hands moving with gentle precision, he didn't walk on. Instead, he pulled a pencil and a small sketch pad from his jacket pocket and leaned against the fence post across the street. He sketched the child first, her posture wobbly but eager, her arms forming something between a pose and a plea. Then he added Sophie, mid-demonstration, her body relaxed, guiding the girl with a grace she didn't seem aware of anymore. He didn't draw their faces, only their forms, motion and stillness, her and the child, caught together. By the time he looked up, the light had shifted and the class was ending. He closed the sketch pad and turned for home. That night, Sophie found the small repairs at the studio, the sticky door no longer caught, and the warped bar was sanded smooth. She didn't need to ask who had done it. No one else would have noticed, let alone fixed it. She looked at the repaired wood for a long moment, then touched it with a kind of gratitude she didn't have words for. Later, in the quiet of her cottage, she stared at a blank page in her sketchbook and wrote something in the corner. Some people speak in blueprints, some in gestures. He speaks in actions. She closed the book, not ready to look at what came next. Sophie had been reorganizing the studio's tiny office when she found it. It happened on a quiet Thursday. She hadn't meant to snoop. She was clearing out old recital flyers and sorting donation receipts when a folder tucked behind a stack of sketch reference books slid loose and spilled onto the desk. Loose pages fluttered out, one of them landing face up. It was a sketch. Pencil, quick but deliberate. A woman in motion paused mid-turn. One foot pointed, one arm lifted. No face, just the arc of her back, the bend of her neck. and the shape of familiarity. She knew it was her. The lines were unmistakable, not idealized or stylized, but real. Her weight, her posture, the way she held tension in her shoulders. Whoever drew it had studied her not as a dancer, but as a person trying to remember how to move. She wasn't sure whether to smile or close the folder. Her fingers lingered on the edge of the page. Daniel. She'd seen the way he carried that small sketch pad, sometimes pulled out when they spoke, sometimes left behind near his tools like an afterthought. But she hadn't expected this, hadn't expected herself to be what had drawn his eye. She placed the drawing back where she found it, tucked into the folder again. But the image lingered with her. He was watching, even when she thought he wasn't. And not just watching, he was seeing. Later that evening, Daniel appeared in the studio doorway again. Not by accident this time. He held a small plastic container and looked mildly uncertain. "You left your tools in the sun," he said. "I thought I'd drop them off, and I brought this." She raised an eyebrow at the container. This turned out to be lemon shortbread, dense and crumbling, and scented with rosemary. "I didn't take you for a baker," she said, amused. "I'm not. My sister is. I asked her for a recipe I couldn't ruin. Let me guess. One bowl, no rising, no special equipment, and exact measurements." "More or less." She took a bite and made an approving face. "Well, looks like you passed the bar." Daniel stood with his hands in his pockets, not quite entering, but not retreating either. "I saw the light on." "You're welcome to stay," she said, gesturing toward the bench along the far wall. He hesitated, then stepped inside and sat. The room felt different with him in it, not tense but expectant, like the air was holding its breath. Sophie picked up her sketchbook and sat across from him. "I found something today," she said after a moment. Daniel looked at her. "In the office, a sketch." His eyes didn't move, but his posture changed, straighter, still. "It was me," she added, her voice soft. "Wasn't it?" He didn't deny it, just nodded once. She flipped her sketchbook open, revealing a faint charcoal study, a garden gate, half open, with wildflowers growing through its hinges. "You see things most people miss." "I don't always mean to." "But you do, that sketch. It wasn't about how I move. It was about how I carry myself." He looked down at his hands. Sophie closed the book. "Why me?" The question wasn't flirtation or curiosity, it was vulnerability. Daniel exhaled. "Because you don't hide behind your stillness. You live through it." She blinked, caught off guard. "And because," he added, quieter now, "you make me wonder what it would be like to move again." The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was honest. Sophie stood and walked over to him, not too close, and sat beside him on the bench. "I used to think stillness meant failure," she said. "Now I think it just means waiting for the right reason to move." They didn't touch, but they sat there together, the room dimming around them, and the world felt like it had gently shifted. As they walked out together later, Daniel said quietly, "Claire's coming." "Your sister?" He nodded. "With her 4 kids and enough questions to rival a grand jury." Sophie laughed. "Should I be nervous?" "Probably," he said. "She's terrifying when she's perceptive, which is always, and way too fond of me." Sophie smiled. "I'll take my chances." The next morning, Daniel's phone rang while he was reorganizing the tool shed. "Claire," he answered. "Hey." "Good morning. So, we're thinking of coming out tomorrow. The kids are restless, and I've promised them a beach walk and cookies the size of their faces." "Of course," he said, brushing sawdust from his sleeve. "You're always welcome. I might also want to meet this Sophie you pretend isn't interesting." Daniel didn't answer. Claire, undeterred, went on, "We'll bring a cooler and stay the night if that's okay. I'll make them sleep on the floor and pretend it's camping." Daniel smiled. "It's fine." "Good. And I'm looking forward to meeting the woman who bakes at midnight and has you sketching people again." Daniel paused. "You didn't hear that from her." "No," Claire replied with a grin he could hear. "But I know how you work. See you tomorrow, big brother." That evening, Sophie saw him sanding the porch rail outside her guest house. She stepped out with a mug of tea and leaned against the post. "You're not fixing anything, are you?" "No." "Then what are you doing?" He glanced up. "Showing up." She smiled. "Well, just so you know, It's working. The storm rolled in fast. Sophie had been walking home from the studio when the wind turned sharp, tugging at her scarf and sending dry leaves skittering across the sidewalk like panicked insects. By the time she reached the guest house, the first drops had started to fall. She knocked on Daniel's back door, soaked from the knees down. "Hi, I come bearing wet socks and no umbrella." Daniel stood in the doorway, barefoot, holding a mug. "Come in." The power flickered once, then went out. Sophie blinked into the sudden hush. "I made tea just before it went," he said, setting the mug on the counter. "You can have mine. I'll make another later." She towed off her shoes and followed him into the kitchen. Rain thudded steadily against the windows, wind brushing past like restless thoughts. "This house feels like it remembers storms," she whispered. "It does," Daniel replied. "Most old houses do." They sat by the kitchen table, the single candle between them casting a halo over the wood grain. Sophie cradled the warm mug between her hands. "Do you ever feel like the weather matches you?" Daniel gave her a long look. "Sometimes." She hesitated. "I used to love storms. When I danced, there was this one piece called Tempesta. It was violent, sharp. My favorite section had a moment where everything paused. One dancer would stand still while chaos spun around her. You were the still one. Always." The rain deepened outside, a steady drumming rhythm. "I didn't mean to give up ballet," she said. "It gave me everything. Discipline, purpose, even identity. I was Sophie the dancer. That's who people saw, who I saw." He didn't rush her, just listened. She set the mug down. "And then one day during rehearsal, something in my knee just gave out. Not even a dramatic fall. Just gone. I thought it was nothing. Surgery, some time in a cast, rehab, and it would all sort itself out. But it never got better." He stayed quiet, giving her the space she hadn't known she needed. "I didn't just lose the work," she said. "I lost the language I spoke, how I told people who I was." Daniel leaned back, candlelight flickering in his eyes. "You haven't stopped dancing," he said. "You just changed your stage." She looked at him, startled by the quiet truth in it. They sat there while the storm raged outside, the silence between them soft, not heavy. The next morning, the storm had passed, leaving dew and light across the yard. Sophie walked back to the studio while Daniel went out to gather scattered branches. She moved more slowly than usual that day, not from pain, from thought. When she returned that afternoon, she saw Claire's car parked by the house. Daniel was helping unload a cooler, while four children buzzed around him like fireflies on espresso. Sophie hung back for a moment, watching. Claire spotted her first. She was sharp-eyed, with the kind of warmth that could cut if you weren't careful. "You must be Sophie," she said, approaching with a smile that was both genuine and evaluating. "I am," Sophie said, extending her hand. "Welcome." Claire took it. "The kids are feral, but we feed them well. I hope we're not disrupting too much." Not at all. The children were already chasing the cats around the garden. Daniel caught Sophie's eye and gave her a look that said help and thank you all at once. Sophie spent the rest of the afternoon getting to know Claire, answering questions that were disguised as small talk. By evening, the kids had claimed the porch for a blanket fort, and Claire had softened. "You know," she said as they sipped tea later, "I was worried at first, but you're good for him." Sophie blinked. "You think so?" "I know so," Claire said. "He doesn't let people in. But with you, I see it. He's not just quieter, he's peaceful." The words stayed with her long after Claire and the kids had gone to bed. Original heartwarming fiction every week. Subscribe for your next great story.